The night Jonathan Winters walked onto the Tonight Show stage on September 19, 1991, Johnny Carson did something he had never done in nearly 30 years of hosting. He stood up before the band finished playing, walked away from his desk, and met his guest halfway across the stage, not at the curtain, not at the desk, halfway. And when the two men embraced in front of 300 people inside Studio One at NBC Burbank, Ed McMahon turned away from the camera and wiped his eyes, because what was about to happen was not an interview, it was a goodbye, and only a handful of people in that building knew it. Jonathan Winters, the wild-eyed genius who had made America laugh harder than almost any human being who had ever lived, sat down across from Johnny Carson that night carrying a secret that had been eating him alive for 3 years. A secret about a night in 1962 when Johnny Carson had done something so quietly, so privately, that Jonathan had never spoken of it publicly. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to Robin Williams, who called him his hero and his second father, not to anyone. But on September 19, 91, Jonathan Winters had decided that silence was no longer something he could afford, because both men were running out of time, and some things need to be said before the curtain falls for the last time. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. September 19, 1991, 4:15 in the afternoon, NBC Studios, Burbank, California. Johnny Carson sat alone in his dressing room with the door locked. His retirement had already been announced. He had told America in May that he would be leaving The Tonight Show the following spring after 30 years, and now, with each taping, the room felt different, heavier. The jokes still landed. The timing was still perfect. Heavier. The joke still landed. The timing was still perfect. But something behind his eyes had changed, and his staff noticed it, even when he pretended everything was fine. His producer knocked twice. "Johnny, Winters is here. Early." Johnny looked up from the desk where he had been sitting doing nothing for 20 minutes. Jonathan Winters did not arrive early for anything in his life. The man operated on his own clock, his own universe, his own entirely invented dimension of reality that the rest of the world was simply lucky enough to visit from time to time. Jonathan Winters arriving early meant something was different, something was wrong, or something was very, very important. "Send him in," Johnny said quietly. But what Johnny did not know, what no one in that building knew except Jonathan himself, was that he had driven to the studio that afternoon with a letter folded in the breast pocket of his jacket, a letter he had written and rewritten 11 times over the past 3 weeks. A letter that began with 3 words he had never said to another man in his 66 years of living: "You saved me." To understand what Jonathan Winters meant by those 3 words, you have to go back, all the way back to the winter of 1962, to a night that television history never recorded, a night that happened not on a stage, but in a parking lot behind a diner on Ventura Boulevard at 2 in the morning, when Jonathan Winters was 37 years old and had already decided he was finished. Most people knew Jonathan Winters as the force of nature, the man who could become 17 different characters inside of 45 seconds, the man who made Jack Parr laugh so hard he once fell sideways off his chair, the man who seemed incapable of existing at anything less than full volume, full color, full throttle. But most people did not know what Jonathan knew about himself, that behind the voices and the faces and the relentless, brilliant, exhausting comedy was a man who had been fighting something dark since childhood, something that had no name in 1962, something that had put him in a psychiatric facility in 1959, something that had nearly swallowed him whole more than once. In December of 1962, Jonathan was coming off one of the hardest stretches of his life. A television project had collapsed. His confidence, always more fragile than the world understood, had shattered in ways that did not show on stage, but showed everywhere else. He was not sleeping. He was not eating properly. He was performing because performing was the one place where the noise in his head organized itself into something useful. But the moment he walked off stage, it all came rushing back. On a Tuesday night in December of 1962, Jonathan Winters found himself sitting in a parking lot behind a diner on Ventura Boulevard at 2 in the morning. He had been driving for 3 hours without any destination. He had pulled over because he could not see clearly anymore. Not because of tears, simply because the weight of what he was carrying had gotten too heavy to see through. And that is where Johnny Carson found him. Johnny had been at the diner with his producer, finishing a late dinner after a taping. He was walking to his car when he saw someone sitting alone on the hood of a vehicle in the dark corner of the lot. He almost kept walking. He almost looked away, but something made him stop. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no music. There was no audience. There was no moment that anyone wrote about or photographed or remembered except two men who were both there. Johnny Carson sat on the hood of that car next to Jonathan Winters, a man he barely knew at the time, and he stayed there for 2 hours. He did not try to fix anything. He did not offer advice. He did not tell Jonathan to think about how lucky he was or how much he had to live for. He simply sat there in the dark of that parking lot on a cold December night and kept him company. And at some point he said something so simple that Jonathan would spend the next 29 years trying to figure out how one sentence could carry that much weight. He said, "You are the funniest man I have ever seen in my life, and I think you are also the most honest. Don't stop." 2 sentences, that was all. But Jonathan Winters heard them differently than they were perhaps intended. He heard permission. He heard someone who had looked at him, not at the performer, not at the characters, not at the legend he was already becoming, but at him, and decided he was worth staying for. He drove home that night. He called his wife Eileen. He slept for the first time in 4 days. He never told Johnny what that night had meant, because in 1962, men did not talk about those things, not publicly, not privately, not in parking lots, and certainly not on television. And then the years went by the way years do, faster and faster, carrying everything with them. But something was about to change. Because September 19th, 1991 was not just another Tonight Show taping. This was one of Johnny Carson's final months on the air. And Jonathan Winters, 66 years old, had decided that if he let this man leave without telling him the truth, he would never forgive himself. If this story already has you holding your breath, stay with me. What happens when Jonathan walks out onto that stage is something that has never been described the way it actually occurred. And it starts with a single piece of paper pulled from a jacket pocket. In the green room, Jonathan Winters sat with the folded letter in his hand. A stage assistant brought him coffee and later told reporters she had never seen him quiet before. Jonathan Winters was the man who once entertained an entire flight crew for 6 hours straight without repeating himself. Quiet was not a state he naturally inhabited, but he was quiet that afternoon, turning the letter over and over, reading it one more time, then folding it again. When the stage manager knocked to give him the 5-minute warning, Jonathan stood up, put the letter back in his breast pocket, and said something that the stage manager never forgot. "Tell John I'm ready. I've been ready for 29 years. The band played. Ed McMahon's voice rolled through the studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, a man who could make a coat rack funny, one of the true originals of American comedy. Please welcome Jonathan Winters." The audience rose. The applause was enormous and warm and carried within it something that applause for Jonathan Winters always carried: genuine joy. People did not just like Jonathan Winters, they were grateful for him. He had gotten them through things. He had made impossible weeks bearable. He had populated their imaginations with characters that felt more alive than most real people they knew. Jonathan walked out, and he was Jonathan. The walk, the eyes scanning the room like a man seeing 17 different movies playing simultaneously, the slight tilt of the head that meant his brain was already 3 jokes ahead of the moment. But when he reached Johnny, something shifted. The audience felt it even before they understood it. The two men looked at each other for just a moment longer than a standard greeting requires. And Johnny, who had already broken his own rule by walking out to meet him, put his hand on Jonathan's shoulder and said quietly, into no microphone that the audience could hear, "I'm glad you're here." Jonathan nodded, and for just a second his eyes did something that the cameras caught, but that most people watching at home did not immediately understand. They filled. The interview began the way you would expect. Jonathan was incandescent. He became 3 different characters inside the first 4 minutes. He turned Johnny's coffee mug into a prop for an extended bit about a sea captain. He did an impression of a man trying to assemble furniture in zero gravity. The audience was breathless with laughter. Ed McMahon was bent forward in his chair. Even the camera operators were shaking. But what nobody noticed, except for Johnny, was that Jonathan kept pausing, just for half a second, just long enough to look at Johnny with an expression that had nothing to do with the bit he was performing, an expression that was checking something, making sure the moment was still there, still real. 18 minutes into the interview, during a pause between stories, Jonathan Winters reached into his breast pocket. The audience went still. They did not know why. The energy simply changed. The way energy changes when something real is about to happen inside a space that is accustomed to performance. Jonathan held the folded letter in both hands. He did not open it, he just held it. Johnny looked at the letter, then at Jonathan. He leaned forward very slightly. "John," Jonathan said, and his voice was the voice no one ever heard on the records or the television specials or the talk show appearances. It was his actual voice, low and steady, and entirely without performance. "I have been carrying something for 29 years, and I'm not leaving this chair tonight without putting it down." The studio audience made no sound. Ed McMahon later said it was the most complete silence he ever heard in 3 decades of sitting beside Johnny Carson. "Do you remember December of 1962, Jonathan asked. "A parking lot on Ventura Boulevard. Late, very late." Johnny Carson's face changed. Slowly, the way a face changes when a memory surfaces from somewhere so deep that the person was not certain the memory was still there. His eyes shifted. His hands, resting on the desk, went still. He remembered. "I don't know if you knew what was happening with me that night," Jonathan said. "I don't know if you had any idea what you sat down next to." He paused. "I was not in a good place. That is the most accurate way I know how to say it. I had been driving for hours. I had pulled over because I did not know where else to go." Johnny's expression had moved past recognition and into something much quieter, something that looked like the beginning of grief, or maybe the end of it. Jonathan continued, "You sat with me for 2 hours. You didn't ask me what was wrong. You didn't tell me it was going to be fine. You just stayed, and then you said something to me." Jonathan opened the letter now. His hands were not entirely steady. "You said I was the funniest man you had ever seen, and the most honest. You said, 'Don't stop.'" He looked up from the paper. "I've been going ever since." What happened next in that studio is the reason people who were in that audience in September of 1991 still talk about it the way they do. Johnny Carson, the man whose composure had become one of the most reliable things in American television, pressed his lips together. He looked down at the desk. His shoulders moved once. And then he did not try to stop what was happening. He cried, quietly, with his hand covering his mouth for a moment, the way a person cries when they are trying very hard not to, and then decide that trying not to is the wrong thing to do. Jonathan set the letter on the desk and reached across and put his hand over Johnny's. The audience was completely silent. Not a single person moved. Finally, Johnny lifted his head. His voice when he spoke was rough at the edges in a way it almost never was on camera. "Jonathan," he said, "I had no idea." "I know you didn't," Jonathan said. "That's why I needed to tell you." Johnny shook his head slowly. "That night, I remember it. I remember thinking you looked like a man carrying the whole world, and I didn't know how to help, so I just didn't leave." Jonathan smiled. "That was everything. That was exactly everything." "You don't understand," Jonathan continued, his voice steadying now into something that felt like relief, like a man who had put down a weight he had forgotten was not supposed to be permanent. "I have thought about that night hundreds of times, when things got hard again in the years after, and they did get hard again more than once. I thought about a man who saw me in a parking lot at 2 in the morning and decided I was worth sitting next to." He leaned forward. "You have been making people laugh for 30 years on this stage, and I love you for that. But John, you saved my life in a parking lot on Ventura Boulevard with 2 sentences and 2 hours of your time, and I needed you to know that before this show ends, before we both run out of chances to say the things that need to be said." The studio erupted then, not into laughter, into something that takes longer to build and matters more when it arrives. The audience stood, and the applause that filled the room was the kind that means we were here for this, we witnessed this, and we are not going to forget it. Ed McMahon was not even trying to compose himself. His face was open and wet and entirely human. Johnny stood up. He walked around his desk for the second time that evening, and he pulled Jonathan Winters to his feet and held him in the kind of embrace that does not perform itself for cameras, but simply is. They stood there together, while the audience kept standing. When they finally separated, Johnny looked at Jonathan for a long moment. Then he turned to the camera with an expression that anyone watching at home understood immediately as the truth. Just the truth. No performance around it at all. He said, 30 years of this show, and I keep thinking I've seen everything there is to see on this stage. He stopped, he shook his head, then quietly, thank you for telling me. Thank you for not letting it go unsaid. Jonathan sat back down. He picked up the letter and held it for a moment. Then he folded it and placed it on the desk between them. He said, I want you to have that. Johnny picked it up. He held it carefully, the way a person holds something they already know they will keep forever. What happened after that broadcast is a story that unfolded slowly, over months and then years. Jonathan Winters gave 3 more interviews in the weeks that followed where he spoke for the first time publicly about mental health, about the struggles that had followed him his whole life, about the shame that his generation had been taught to carry in silence, and the damage that silence does over decades. He spoke without drama, without performance, in that low, steady voice that the audience at NBC had heard for the first time that September evening. He said, funny people are not always happy people. And the world needs to know that, because there are people out there right now laughing on the outside and disappearing on the inside, and they think they are the only ones. They are not the only ones. They have never been the only ones. The response was immediate and enormous. NBC received more letters after that broadcast than after any Tonight Show taping that year. Not letters about the comedy. Letters from people who said they saw themselves in what Jonathan had described. People who had been driving at 2 in the morning and not known where to stop. People who had been performing a version of themselves for so long that they had nearly forgotten where the performance ended. Mental health organizations reported a significant increase in calls in the weeks that followed. Therapists across the country said patients were bringing up Jonathan Winters in sessions, not because of the jokes, because of the parking lot, because of the 2 hours, because of Don't Stop. Johnny Carson carried that letter for the rest of his life. After his death in 2005, it was found among his most personal belongings, still folded in the same way Jonathan had placed it on that desk. Jonathan Winters lived until 2013. He was 87 years old. In the final years of his life, he spoke often about the importance of telling the people who mattered to you what they meant, before the window closed, before the show ended, before one of you ran out of time. He said, the things that save us are usually small. A phone call, 2 hours, 2 sentences. But we wait because we think there will be a better moment. There will not be a better moment. This moment is the moment. Use it. Robin Williams, who loved Jonathan Winters the way a person loves someone who showed them what was possible, said in an interview years later that watching that September 1991 taping was one of the most important things he had ever seen on television. He said, Jonathan taught me everything about comedy, but that night he taught me something about life. He said the true thing instead of the easy thing. He used the platform not to perform but to be real. That is the hardest thing anyone can do in front of a camera, and he made it look like the most natural thing in the world. Johnny Carson's final Tonight Show aired on May 22, 1992. In his goodbye, he mentioned no specific moment, named no specific guests, made no long list of favorite memories. He kept it brief and warm and entirely like himself. But the people who knew him said that in the months between September 1991 and that final broadcast, something in him was different, lighter somehow, as though he had been carrying something that he had not known was weighable until someone named it for him. Every year after he retired, on the 19th of September, a card would arrive at Jonathan Winters' house. No return address. Inside, the same 2 words, every single year without exception. Still remembering. Jonathan always knew who it was from. He kept every card in the same drawer as his copy of the letter he had placed on that desk. The letter that had taken him 29 years to write, and 30 seconds to hand across. There are things in your life right now that you have been meaning to say to someone who stayed, to someone who sat next to you when you did not know where else to go, to someone who said something so simple that you have been living off of it for years without ever telling them. This is the moment, not tomorrow, not when things settle down, not at the next opportunity that always turns out to be smaller than the one you just passed. Jonathan Winters waited 29 years. He almost waited too long. He sat down in that chair in September of 1991 and said what needed to be said because he had finally understood that the window does not stay open indefinitely. Tell the person, write the letter, make the call, say the thing that has been true for 20 years and simply has not been spoken yet. Because somewhere in your life there is a Johnny Carson who sat with you in a parking lot at 2 in the morning and does not know, has never known what those 2 hours meant. And they deserve to know. They have always deserved to know. Don't let it go unsaid. Subscribe to this channel because every week we bring you stories like this one. True stories about the moments when television stopped being entertainment and started being something that changed lives. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from right now, because this story is reaching people everywhere, and I want to know where Jonathan's voice is landing tonight. And remember, the funniest man in the room is not always the happiest man in the room. Check on the people who make you laugh. Sit with them in the dark when they need it. Stay. 2 hours and 2 sentences. That is all it took. That is all it ever takes.